I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Tonight, I want to take a few minutes to look back at what has been a really remarkable week last week on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. A week that took us from war and diplomacy in Eastern Europe to taxes and transparency in Mississauga to pluralism, clean energy, art, and the future of Canadian innovation. If there's a common thread, it's this: who leads, who decides, and who benefits from policy, from power, and from progress. Let's start on Monday. Ukraine, the leaked peace plan, and the risk of another Munich. I was joined by Peter Dickinson, the Ukrainian editor at the Atlantic Council, to dig into what the leaked so-called U.S. peace proposal for Ukraine was, a 28-point document that frankly looks like it was written in Moscow and just ran through Google Translate. We walked through how the language is steeped in Russian diplomatic framing, how it contemplates forced territorial concessions in Donetsk, and how once again there's a peace process happening largely without Ukraine, even in the room. Peter laid out why Ukrainians simply don't trust Western security guarantees after the Budapest Memorandum, why the proposed guarantees look weak and unenforceable, and why Russia is suddenly so eager for a deal, even if it grinds forward on the battlefield. We talked about Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, the mood in European capitals, the U.S. election calendar, and what it all means for NATO and the global order. At its core, that show was about the cost of confusion and weakness in a great power diplomacy and the danger of repeating the mistakes of Munich with a nuclear-armed autocrat. On Tuesday, we brought it home to Mississauga. If Monday was about geopolitical accountability, Tuesday was about municipal accountability. I was joined by three incredibly diligent local residents, George Tavares, Kim Pines, and Athena Tigadillo, people who have spent hours and hours going line by line through Mississauga's budget because, frankly, someone had to. We asked a simple question: why are Mississauga taxes rising faster than inflation? 2 and 3 times faster than inflation, year after year after year, while transparency and service quality seems to be going the other way. We talked about the blended rate trick, dividing your bill into city, region, and education, so the headline increase looks smaller, even though the city portion you actually control is climbing far more aggressively. We dig into the governance imbalance, where Mississauga funds about 62% of Peel Police, but doesn't have equivalent voting power around the table. We explored the myth that there's no room to cut, even when disciplined analysis suggests 2 to 3% savings are possible without touching core services. And we connected to what people feel: rising crime, slower transit, congestion, stalled projects, and growing frustration with a system that we don't think people listen. Tuesday's show was about democracy at the local level, about whether City Hall treats taxpayer dollars with the same discipline families bring to their own budgets. On Wednesday, we zoomed out again, but this time to the big ideal of pluralism. My guest was Meredith Preston McGee, Secretary General of the Global Center for Pluralism and one of the world's most experienced conflict resolution practitioners. For nearly 30 years, she's been at the front lines, from Northeast India to Kenya, Nigeria, South Sudan, Somalia, and beyond. And what she's learned is that pluralism isn't some soft, idealistic word. It's strategy. We talked about how societies manage deep differences under stress: ethnicity, religion, language, history. We asked whether pluralism is essential for democracy or simply complementary to it. We looked at real examples, communities that broke down and others that pulled back from the brink, because teachers, youth workers, artists, and local leaders made the hard choice to build bridges instead of walls. Bridges instead of walls. What I loved about the conversation was the optimism was grounded in reality. Meredith isn't naive about conflict. She's lived in it around the world, but she believes that ordinary people, you and I, can build pluralism in very practical ways. who we listen to, who we stand up for, and how we design our institutions. On Thursday, we turned to the future of energy with Greg Vesna. Greg, the president of Hydrofuel Inc., walked us through a vision of clean tech that is much more practical and frankly more exciting than a lot of the political slogans we're hearing today. We talked about ammonia as a carrier for hydrogen, micro-ammonia plants and petrochemical reactors that can turn methane into clean hydrogen and valuable carbon products using only light. We compared pipelines to power lines. We discussed why grade 9 math and science actually matter for policy and what it would take for Canada to stop talking about being an energy superpower and actually becoming one. It was one of the most forward-looking conversations we've had, and it fits squarely into a theme that kept coming back this week. Canada has incredible scientific talent. The question is whether we have the will, the capital, and the courage to commercialize it here. From there, at the end of the week, we shifted into art, identity, and overcoming with Steep Daniels, also known as Jesus Guggenheimer. Steep is the 2025 resident artist at the Grand Polish Film Festival. His story is extraordinary. We talked about how a spontaneous act, plastering tribute prints around Toronto after the musician's death, led to festival producers noticing his work, inviting him in, commissioning more, and eventually making him a central artistic voice at Ekran. We explored his exhibition of 14 paintings, his film Overcoming Steep, his Polish heritage, and the symbolism and humor that ran through Polish cinema. And we talked about Sick Kids, how the hospital gave him crayons as a child, and how he turned that early gift into almost 100 grand, raising through projects like Jump for Sick Kids, convincing nearly 100 people to skydive to mirror the bravery of hospitalized kids. That show was about how art becomes action, how creativity becomes community, and how one person's story can inspire others to overcome their own steep climbs. And then we closed the week by talking about Canadian innovation with Professor Neil Seaman. Neil is an entrepreneur, professor, researcher, and now a business columnist, and he voiced something I've heard over and over on this show. Canada doesn't have a creativity problem. We have a commercialization problem. We invent the future, the science behind the mRNA vaccines, GLP-1 drugs, AI, clean tech, and then we watch someone else build the factories, create the jobs, and capture the wealth. We talked about why real innovation doesn't happen on big glossy conference stages, but in honest conversations, late night arguments, and messy collaborations. We discussed why vulnerability, not bravado, builds better entrepreneurs, why young Canadians are leaving, why we underinvest in capital equipment, R&D, and scaling, and what it takes to keep our talent here in Canada and our IP here at home. It was a sharp, candid, and at times uncomfortable look at where Canada stands in the 21st century economy. When you put all these shows last week together, Ukraine, Mississauga, pluralism, clean energy, art, and innovation, a bigger picture emerges. We are at a moment where global security is in flux. Local democracy is under strain. Diverse societies are being tested. The energy transition is accelerating. Culture is pushing us to rethink identity and purpose, and our economy is asking whether we want to be makers or merely markets. My hope is that the Brian Crombie Hour can be a place where we wrestle with all of that, honestly, respectfully, and with a bias towards solutions. If you missed any of these conversations, you can find the replays on YouTube. Just search the Brian Crombie Hour, or on podcast platforms, or on my website, briancrombie.com. And as always, thank you for listening, for thinking along with us, and for being a part of this ongoing conversation about how we build a better community, a better country, and a better world together. And now this week, everyone is going to be exposed to, I think, an even more exciting week this week. We've got one of the most compelling lineups I've ever put together. 5 nights, 5 conversations, each shining a light on a different part of Canadian life. From politics and real estate to immigration, democracy, and then the human spirit. Let me walk you through what's happening this week. On Monday, I've got Nick Nanos on Canada's political crossroads. We begin the week with one of the sharpest minds in political polling and political analysis, Nick Nanos of Nanos Research. Nick and I dive into the shifting political landscape in Canada, why the Conservatives can't seem to break through even as the NDP struggles, why the Liberals have seen a slight uptick, and how much of that is connected to the very strong public impressions Canadians have of Prime Minister Mark Carney. We look at the incredible statistic that several federal ridings were decided by as few as 60 votes and what that means for the next election. Every vote counts. And then we zoom out to questions of energy, pipelines, Indigenous involvement, Alberta politics, and even why some Albertans are talking about joining the United States. It's data, it's analysis, it's the story behind the headlines, and it's one of Canada's most respected political voices. On Tuesday, I've got Fred Cassano on the future of real estate. We shift to the economy, specifically the real estate market, with Fred Cassano, who's the national real estate leader at PwC Canada. Fred brings insights from PwC's massive industry survey of over 1,250 leaders, and together we break down what's really happening: the frozen condo market, the surprising resilience of AAA office, labor shortages, ESG pressures, and the explosive demand for purpose-built rentals. We talk about the housing crisis, why Canada needs to build 500,000 homes a year, and why we're nowhere close. We explore the data centers, infrastructure constraints, and why Calgary may be beating Ontario to be the emerging AI and cloud economy. And we ask the big question: what will it take to build enough homes fast enough for the next generation to actually afford to live in our country? Wednesday, I've got Parisa Makarubi on rebuilding Canada's immigration system. She's with the C.D. Howe Institute, one of Canada's leading voices on immigration reform. Parisa argues that something many policymakers are finally starting to realize: more is not always better. What matters most is who we welcome, their skills, their language ability, their education, and their capacity to contribute. We talk about temporary foreign workers, the explosion of international students, and a permanent residency system that has become unpredictable and frustrating for newcomers. We discuss how immigration pressures are affecting housing, infrastructure, and public confidence, and what reforms are actually needed to get this system right. Parisa combines deep research with her own lived experience as a family class immigrant, giving us both the evidence and the humanity behind this issue. On Thursday, I've got Joanne Roberts on voter turnout and lowering the voting age from 18 to 16. Joanne Roberts is a writer, a former interim leader of the Green Party, and an author of a book called Storm the Ballot Box, for a passionate discussion about voter turnout and the future of civic engagement in Canada. We are losing voters. Turnout is falling. And among young Canadians, the numbers are staggering. Only 46.7% of 18 to 24-year-olds voted in the last federal election. Joanne argues that lowering the voting age to 16 could be one of the smartest reforms we can make, and she brings evidence from Austria, Brazil, Scotland, Wales, and soon the UK, showing that 16 and 17-year-olds actually vote, and vote more reliably than new voters at 18. We also talk about civics education, electoral reform, recall elections, term limits, and the Supreme Court case that could push Canada to expand the franchise once again. If you care about democracy, this is a conversation you'll want to hear. And then on Friday, we finish the week with one of the most emotional and inspiring interviews I've ever done. My guest is Amanda Caruso, a survivor, an advocate, an entrepreneur, a lawyer, and author of Becoming the Brave One: My Journey to Justice. Amanda has lived through an extraordinary trauma, multiple sexual assaults, a violent childhood, and the horrific murder of her sister and her sister's family. But she has emerged as a powerful advocate for healing, restorative justice, and emotional courage. We talk about shame, resilience, forgiveness, parenting, relationships, community, anger, love, and how she transformed her pain into purpose. Amanda's message is extraordinary. No matter what you've been through, you can heal. You can reclaim your voice. You can become brave. It's one of the most powerful conversations we've ever aired. So join me this week, all this week, at 6 p.m. on Saga 960, or stream me live at saga960am.ca. And every show is available afterward on my YouTube channel and on podcast servers and on my website, briancrombie.com. I'm Brian Crombie, and this is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, where the conversations that matter happen. Thanks.